The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 left Russia or Russian Federation with economic malaise, rapid inflation, and sharp escalation in foreign debt. Even after the collapse, Russia, the nation with the largest landmass and 143 million people, spans multiple continents with 11 time zones and shares borders with 14 other nations. What happens in Russia does matter, not only to these neighbors, but also around the world. Today we are going to focus on what happened in Russia in the last 2 decades and how the bankrupt nation at birth managed to build wealth fund of more than $600 billion in less than a decade, held the country together and still project the power abroad. We are delighted to have with us Professor Chris Miller, who will be sharing his insights and explain to us what happened during the tumultuous last 20 years. Welcome to Redera.
Thanks for having me.
Fascinating book titled Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia. What was the inheritance of Vladimir Putin, then the head of the FSB, the next incarnation of the KGB, and how the situation was around at that time, and how did he come to power? If you can give us a little bit of introduction to that.
Sure, thanks. Well, I think to understand how Putin came to power, it's actually useful to rewind not only several years, but over a decade. Putin was trained, as you mentioned, in the KGB. He served abroad in East Germany in the city of Dresden. And he was serving there right as the Soviet Union was dissolving. He was in some ways a person who lost out from the dissolution of the Soviet Union because he had worked for the organization that had done the best in the Soviet period. And so he had plenty of reason to lament the demise of the Soviet Union, but he also, at the same time, understood the problems the Soviet Union faced. And the number one problem from his perspective that the Soviet Union faced was not a political problem per se. It wasn't that the Soviet Union was insufficiently democratic or that it violated its citizens' rights. The problem that Putin saw in the Soviet Union was that its economy fell apart during the 1980s under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the Soviet leader from 1985 to 1991. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Putin found himself more or less without a career, without a job, and involved himself in local government in St. Petersburg, the town that he was originally from, and soon came to take the role of deputy mayor under a relative liberal named Anatoly Sobchak. And Putin was involved in a variety of activities, one of the more important of which was the management of foreign trade and foreign investment in St. Petersburg. And so he had an interesting vantage point to watch Russia transition from the centrally planned socialist economy in the Soviet period to the capitalist economy that emerged after the Soviet Union. And Putin himself had interactions with many foreign businesses and many of the new private entrepreneurs in Russia during that time period. That was a positive experience in the sense that it gave him the ability to understand a little bit how market economics works, but the specifics of what he was doing, helping foreigners get permits to trade in St. Petersburg and helping Russians get permits to export abroad, also exposed him at a very early date to the benefits of controlling parts of the economy and using them for political purposes. And so there's pretty substantial evidence that the parts of the economy that Putin was interacting with very extensively in the early 1990s, especially export of oil and gas from the area around St. Petersburg, were deeply intertwined, not only with foreign markets, but also domestically with various mafia groups. And so from the earliest stage, the question of economic governance was for Putin both a question of political survival. He realized that the Soviet Union failed because it didn't have a good economy. But the economy was also a political tool that, if harnessed and used in a wise way, Putin believed could be useful for politicians. That's how Putin saw the question of economics and politics writ large. The specific challenges that Russia faced when Putin came to power in Moscow at the end of the 1990s were in some ways not dissimilar from the problems that had persisted in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, which is a massive budget deficit, a rapid rate of inflation with prices increasing at double-digit or sometimes triple-digit rates in a single year. And the result of that was macroeconomic chaos and the sense that the economy was unable to produce any sort of stable growth. And so Putin's number one task from the perspective of the Russian public was to somehow stabilize the economy. And that mapped on very well with his own perception of what a ruler needs to do in order to retain power, which is control the economy and harness it for the ruler's own purposes. And so when Putin finally became president at the start of the 2000s, that was the framework that he used to understand the economy. It's how can it be controlled and harnessed for the good of the state.
As you explained very well in the book, Russia's influence, even within its own nation, or the influence of the president's office across the entire region of Russia was very limited. It was declining rapidly, and many times local leaders and regional leaders were just doing their own thing.
That's right. And one of the things that I think we often forget is that when the Soviet Union was followed by the establishment of an independent Russian state in late 1991, early 1992, the institutions that generally underlie a state, a tax system, a system of law, a law enforcement system, those didn't automatically spring up. They had to be created over time. And so all of the pathologies of the Soviet system, political pathologies, economic pathologies, all of these persisted throughout the first decade of independent Russia. And Putin diagnosed many of these correctly. He realized that Russia did face a legal regime in which people didn't often follow the rules, especially powerful people. He realized that Russia had a tax regime in which no one, or at least the rich, didn't pay taxes. And he decided that this needed to change. And the tool to change the tool to address both of these issues was the centralization of power. Now, there were pros and cons to centralizing power. The cons are that all of the decisions came to be made in the Kremlin, which required wise decision makers who thought in the public interest, which is something that Russia obviously hasn't subsequently had. But the benefit of centralization was that Putin could enforce his writ across the country and also enforce economic rules as well. And so from the earliest stages, Putin and his allies tried to put in power people who thought like them and people who would be able to mobilize state resources to make sure that the rules established by the Kremlin were followed. And so there's been excellent work by sociologists in Russia who have tracked the number of people from the security services in high positions in government, whether from the KGB, from the military, from other parts of the security establishment. And what they find is that in the early 2000s, the early years of the Putin system, there was a substantial increase in the number of security services personnel serving in civilian positions in government. So in some ways, this was a sort of slow motion coup, but it wasn't a coup led by the military. It was a coup led by the former KGB agents who were very unhappy with the direction that the country had taken in the 1990s and wanted to see a reestablishment of a strong central authority in the Kremlin.
So as Putin is appointed to the head of the Russian leadership, and he is confronting many challenges, and he assesses the situation, rightly so, and he focuses right onto the economics. And even in economics, he builds the structure of his people, he spreads them out, and he goes about saying that I'm the top guy here and you better listen to me or there will be consequences. And one of the biggest challenges that he had to deal with was chaotic capitalism during the time of Yeltsin that was run by oligarchs. Tell us, what were the oligarchs doing and why they became problematic for Putin?
In the 1990s, when Boris Yeltsin was president of Russia, there were a variety of oligarchs who were individuals that had gained control of different assets, legacies from the Soviet period. Some of them owned car companies, others steel mills, other banks, and they used these assets to acquire vast fortunes, but also to wield political power. And indeed, in the case of many of these oligarchs, their fortunes actually stemmed from their political power. They were politically influential and were therefore able to privatize state assets at a discounted price, or able to win special contracts from the states. And throughout most of the 1990s, oligarchs were in many ways as influential as the government, especially on economic questions. And they were deeply resented by most of the Russian populace for this reason. So when Putin took control of the presidency in around 2000, he was supported by the populace when he said that his goal was to bring the oligarchs down a notch, to control the oligarchs. But what he did was not abolish oligarchs as a class, but rather supplant them with his own oligarchs, people who he felt could be trusted, both to run the businesses effectively that they were provided, and also to remain loyal to him personally. And so the oligarchs have shifted dramatically over the past 20 years of Putin's time. Gone are the days that we saw in the 1990s, where there were independent oligarchs that would contradict what the president said during the Yeltsin period. Today, every oligarch knows that if he contradicts the president on an important issue, he risks not only the control of his wealth, but also his personal safety. So the oligarchs are very politically pliable today in a way that they were not in the 1990s. Instead, what Russia has today is a class of new oligarchs of a new type. And today there are a couple of different types of oligarchs. One are longtime friends of President Putin. A number of the people he practiced judo with in St. Petersburg have now become billionaires thanks to their ties with him. So that's one group of oligarchs. A second group is former KGB colleagues of Putin, people such as Igor Sechin, the CEO of Rosneft, and others who have come to dominate massive state-owned firms. And then a third set of oligarchs are the survivors from the 1990s, those oligarchs who gained vast fortunes in the 1990s, and then when Putin came to power, immediately cut deals with Putin and his allies and said, we will agree to do anything you want on the political front so long as you leave us in control of our assets. And Putin took up that deal with most of the oligarchs and said, so long as you stay out of politics, you can continue owning whatever factory, whatever business you own. But the moment you step into politics or contradict my desires on an important issue is the moment you lose your business. And there were a couple of key cases that underscored Putin's willingness and his ability to punish the oligarchs for not following the rules. And three in particular stand out in the earliest days of Putin's time in office. One, Boris Berezovsky was exiled to London, later found dead either by hanging, whether a suicide or not is unknown. A second, Gruzinski, was jailed and then exiled as well in the early 2000s. And then third and most famously, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was Russia's richest man, arrested and then imprisoned for almost a decade before being released and then exiled in the middle of the last decade. And so these three very high-profile cases made it clear to all of the other oligarchs that you could still hold on to your assets. And many of the oligarchs in the 1990s still live in Russia and are still billionaires, but you can only do so if you promise to keep your nose out of politics.
But the economy is still weak, and Putin deciding who the enemies of the state or him are, he went clearly after some of the oligarchs, as you mentioned. But what was the confidence source that he had? Where was he deriving his strength? Who were the forming his political base? And as we all know, Russia was ever dependent and still very dependent on volatile oil prices, and oil prices were still very weak. Tell us how that all came together. As the oil prices started moving up, he decided clearly to focus on certain oligarchs, as you mentioned, but he also did something very pragmatic and something very different, a loose versus tight monetary policy. Tell us, how did he go about that?
That's right. Well, when Putin first came to power, he needed to assemble a coalition, and he found that if he implemented a certain type of macroeconomic policies, he could do that. He could acquire a coalition of supporters that would back him. A crucial part of the coalition from the outset was his fellow colleagues from the KGB, who, as I mentioned, played important roles in the government bureaucracy as provincial governors in similar positions like that. But he was also able very early on to establish economic stability of the type that Russians had wanted in the 1990s but had been unable to achieve. And the tools that he used to do that were twofold. First, he implemented a series of economic policies that were broadly orthodox, I think you would call them, or conservative even. He made sure inflation was kept low, and indeed for most of his presidency it's been in the single digits, which is somewhat unique for post-independent Russia. He kept the budget deficit low and paid down almost all of Russia's foreign debt quite quickly in his presidency. Again, that provided stability in the face of economic shocks. And on the question of oil, Putin made sure that when oil prices did begin to increase in the middle and late 2000s, the portion of the price increase was saved so that when oil prices would later fall, as everyone knew that they some point would, Russia had a substantial amount of savings with which to plug the subsequent holes in its budgets during times of low oil prices. And so this set of policies, conservative fiscal policy, a orthodox monetary policy, and a focus on saving oil revenues when oil prices were high, gave Russia a very strong buffer to survive when oil prices declined, as they did later that decade and several times since then. So that's a crucial aspect of understanding Putin's economic policy in the first term. But that's only part of the story. That's the first peg on which this policy was built. The second leg was that Putin came to power at a very lucky time. Putin was made prime minister in 1999. In 1998, Russia had the worst economic crisis of the post-Soviet period. The ruble had fallen very sharply against the dollar. There was a banking crisis. Inflation shot upwards to double-digit rates. And so Putin came to power the year after that horrible economic crisis, at a time when an economic recovery was, to a certain extent, guaranteed. And then the recovery after the 1998 crisis was quickly followed in the early to mid 2000s by oil prices that increased fairly steadily over the course of the decade. So Putin deserves, I think, some credit for implementing relatively sensible economic policies in the 2000s. It's also crucial to note to the extent to which he had a very benign foreign economic outlook, because the price of Russia's number one export, oil, was relatively high and rising over the course of his first decade in power. And it was both of those combined, smart policy and good luck, that made Putin's first decade in office a very successful one. Throughout most of that decade, Russian real wages grew at a quite rapid clip, approaching even double digits in certain years. And because wages were growing so much, tax revenue was also growing, and so the Russian government was able to spend more as well, and it spent quite lavishly on pension benefits in particular in the 2000s. And so when wages were increasing rapidly, pension payouts were increasing rapidly, it was easy for Putin to be popular because everyone was becoming much and much richer over the course of the 2000s.
And as you mentioned, the combination of luck and smart policy, for those of us who may not remember, Venezuela was richer than Russian Federation in 1999. Today, after 20 years, there are two different outcomes. We don't have to describe them, but we all know where Venezuela is and where Russia is. Putin, in many ways, in the late 90s and early 2000s, was a very practical man. He was focused on making sure that his finances were sorted out, his economic influence, his influence was rising in the economy, and he was also very willing to confront the oligarchs who would cross him. And how did he dealt with the ever-rising demand from the other members of the parliament or Russian Duma, as the oil prices were rising and the nation's income was rising as well, for building more or giving out more money or spending more? But he resisted, and he never let on it. He never gave up on it.
That's right. And I think to understand why that was possible, it's crucial to realize that although we like to talk about Putin, and although I've written a book called Putinomics, in fact, there's more to Russian politics than just Putin. And in some ways, the argument that I put forward in the book is that although Putin has come to embody the economics and the politics of the past 20 years of Russia, in many ways, he personally is just representative of a broader trend, a broader set of ideas that have taken hold across the Russian elite. Because what's, I think, important to note is that Putin himself is no economic theorist. He's far from an expert in economic policy. And the reason that Russia has followed the policies that it's followed is not only that Putin has supported a policy of low inflation, of low budget deficits, of conservative fiscal policy, but also because many of Russia's elites have bought into them as well. And so when Putin wanted to appoint conservative officials to the finance ministry, officials who were going to reject many demands for more state spending, he was supported in that decision by many people in the Russian elite. And so the finance ministry in particular was made into an institution that throughout the 2000s and the 2010s was extraordinarily orthodox in economic policy terms. It stuck towards policies that international institutions like the IMF regularly credited with being very responsible, because both Putin and the rest of the Russian elite believe that was the right policy. Now you could ask, well, why would they have thought that this type of very conservative fiscal monetary policy was right for Russia? But I think if you put yourself in the mind of someone in Putin's generation, and consider what they had come through by the time they took power in the 2000s, their desire for conservative monetary and fiscal policies becomes more clear. And that's in 1998, they had a very severe financial crisis that resulted in a surge of inflation. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it collapsed again amid a financial crisis and rapid inflation. And so they'd lived through two very severe crises that were caused by this type of surge in overspending and undertaxing. And so as a result, there was a great aversion across the Russian political elite for any sort of deficit spending, because most Russian elites believed that that was the exact policy that had led to the economic problems that ultimately destroyed the Soviet Union, and then a decade later led to the 1998.
Just as Putin, so was Russian elites and also the people of Russia all bought into it, and as a result, Putin was able to avoid large deficits, cut down foreign debts, and also practically eliminate rapid inflation. Tell us a little bit more about the finance minister, Alexei Kudrin. He played some very key role, and also he laid the structure that led to the rise or the success of the wealth fund, which is an idea that Russian elite had already bought into it after two major crises, as you explained.
That's right. Alexei Kudrin is one of the more interesting figures in contemporary Russia. He's, unlike most of Russia's elite, trained as an economist. He did his training in the late Soviet period. Like Putin, he's from St. Petersburg, and so connected with many of the same individuals that have been key supporters of Putin during his time in power. And Kudrin was finance minister for much of the 2000s and was credited with promoting this type of cautious, conservative economic policy, macro fiscal policy over the course of this period. Kudrin also, interestingly, has been a voice for more liberal politics in Russia. Not a very effective voice, but repeatedly has made suggestions that Russia ought to be more democratic, more respecting of minority views, things of that nature, closer to the West, for example. And what's interesting, I think, is how a sort of liberal within the system like Kudrin can exist alongside a set of elites who are closer to Putin in their nationalistic views and their more authoritarian habits. And where you see the overlap is in economic policy, where someone like Kudrin believes that, broadly speaking, Russia has taken the right economic policies over the past 2 decades, even if Kudrin disagrees with some of the more authoritarian political turns, as he says he does, and as I think we ought to believe that he does. And so this, I think, shows the power in some ways of these types of cautious, conservative economic policies in Putin's Russia. They're popular not only among the statist nationalists, among the former KGB agents, they're also popular among the business class and the more liberally minded parts of the Russian society and the Russian political elite too. And that explains, I think, why these policies have been so durable over 20 years as political coalitions have shifted, as global economic conditions have shifted, as Russia's foreign policy context has shifted. Nevertheless, the economic policies haven't changed. They remain focused on low inflation, focused on low budget deficits, and focused on making sure that the government isn't running up massive debts. And that's because they have this broad social base among different parts of Russian society.
The painful memories of the 1980s and early 19s were not forgotten by the people and the elite of Russia. In many ways, Putin and Gorbachev are two different people. Gorbachev couldn't resist any spending, and he was always willing to incentivize, quote-unquote, industries with subsidies. And Putin, by one estimate, almost saved 30 cents on every dollar that the government received from the export of energy. And all of that money pretty much went into the National Wealth Fund.
That's right. And especially in the 2000s, the amount of savings that the government was undertaking was really quite substantial. And I think the best way to explain this is as a sort of political learning process by the Russian elite. That the Russian elite of the 2000s was in many ways not all that different from the Soviet elite that had driven the government budget into deep deficit during the Gorbachev era. In some ways, the key players were actually unchanged. You can look at, for example, the leadership of companies like Gazprom and Rosneft, and in many ways, there were many continuities in those companies between the Soviet period than there was evidence of change. But the one thing that certainly did change, even if the elites only changed somewhat, the institutions only changed somewhat, the context did change, which is that in the 1980s, there was no experience among all the Soviet elite of having lived through economic crisis. They'd lived through the war in some cases, the older generation, and they'd lived through stagnation of the Soviet economy in the 1970s and 1980s, but no one had lived through a financial crisis. No one knew the risks that hyperinflation posed or that government budget deficits could lead in that direction. There were, of course, economists who said, in theoretical terms, this could happen. There were experts in other countries' economies that could write about how this was happening in other places, but no one had lived through it on their own. By the 2000s, everyone in Russia had lived through not one, but two painful financial crises, not only in their lifetime, but in recent memory. And so the entire thought process of the elite shifted as a result of that experience. And so that, I think, explains why savings rates were so high and why willingness to adopt these types of conservative, cautious policies was so much higher than they were in the Gorbachev period, when, in fact, there was almost no one who was concerned about inflation, when, in fact, they had every reason to be in the 1980s.
As we are still discussing the first decade of Putin in power, the good times lasted all the way until 2007, when oil prices kept rising. There was no limit to where the oil prices could go, and then suddenly the financial crisis hit in 2008 and 2009, and so did the oil price collapse with it. Yet, in many ways, Russia, Putin, was prepared for it. And how did they earn almost $200 billion in 2007, additional money that they would not have earned if the oil prices had been normal? Almost squandered it in 2008, all of that, by trying to save ruble and protect the emerging banking crisis. Tell us how the Bank of Russia navigated all that, and in some ways successfully, but also paid a heavy price with the depreciation of ruble.
Well, that's right. The 2008 crisis posed a real dilemma for Russia because, on the one hand, as you mentioned, there was incredible pressure on the ruble to depreciate, which was common across emerging markets, especially those like Russia that were fairly exposed to oil prices, which were also plummeting at the time. But at the same time, many Russian companies, especially banks, were heavily exposed to dollar liabilities, and so a decline in the exchange rate would increase the ruble value, the ruble cost of their dollar debt repayments. And so there was sort of a mechanistic relationship. If the ruble declined by a lot, the number of financial problems in banks would increase by a comparable amount. And so the question was what to do, what balance to strike between bank bailouts and letting the ruble decline. The good news from Russia's perspective was that they had plenty of reserves with which to deal with it. So the central bank was able to a certain extent, smooth the ruble's decline, paying a heavy price to do so, but nevertheless succeeding in that effort. And the Russian government had plenty of funds with which to bail out banks when needed. Now, I think there's plenty of questions to be asked about whether this was a economically optimal policy response. Probably not. Was it roughly effective? I think you'd say yes, it was. And the conclusion that the Russian government drew from it was twofold. One, they drew the conclusion that to the extent possible, it was better to have a floating exchange rate rather than a fixed exchange rate, because if you have a floating exchange rate, then corporates are more likely to take the risks of future depreciation seriously and consider their borrowing more carefully as a result. And so after the 2008-2009 crisis, the Russian government and the Russian central bank slowly but steadily moved towards a floating exchange rate. And that was a very wise thing to do, in my view. Second, the Russian government realized that whenever there was going to be a big slump in the price of oil, although they didn't like it, it was basically going to be politically impossible not to have bank bailouts occurring at the same time, because the banking system was just too exposed to those types of swings. And so when the next oil crash came in 2014, 2015, there was another round of bank bailouts, which again, not economically optimal, not a great use of taxpayer money in sort of theoretical sense, but when financial crises come, the risk of banks failing is usually simply too high. Now you could ask, was there a way that the Russian government could have devised policy to better capitalize banks, to prevent them from making risky loans, and to obviate the need for them to get bailouts? And the answer is certainly yes, there was. And this, I think, points to the downsides of economic policy in the Putin era. On the macro side, the track record is very good. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, both get high marks. On the micro regulatory side, the track record is much more mixed. And so financial regulation is a great example of this, banking regulation. Banks have been very poorly regulated in general, in part because banks have been ways for many powerful elites to siphon money off of corporations or out of the state. And so as a result, tightening up banking regulation has been very, very politically challenging. It's taken a lot of time, a lot of political effort, because there are many powerful people in Russia who don't want tighter banking regulation. And so this is the sort of second side of the coin of economic policy in Putin's Russia. The macro policy has been good, the micro policy much less so. And there are costs to having micro policy that's not optimal. The costs are these types of banking bailouts, or higher prices due to monopolies, or other issues that are caused by weak regulatory policies, in contrast to the strong macroeconomic policies.
So despite the almost 35% devaluation of ruble during the financial crisis from 25 ruble to a dollar to 33 ruble to a dollar, Bank of Russia and Putin managed to navigate the crisis quite well. But there was a cost, as you mentioned in the book, and the cost was largely borne by the individuals through high inflation. But people were, by and large, putting up with it simply because the stability was highly priced, and people were willing to accept the higher inflation as long as the stability was there and the goods were available. So that brings us to the first decade or first 12 years of Putin's era, and then Putin reappears in the second term, and the things get a little bit different. The context is different, the challenges are different, and in 2014, the oil crisis puts Putin to a dramatically different challenge. And how did Putin rise to that occasion, and how did he handle that?
Well, the 2014 crisis is important to realize both the similarities it shares with 2008, 2009, but also the differences. The similarity is in the decline in oil price, which was just as rapid in many ways in 2014 as it was in 2008, and the subsequent pressure it put on the exchange rate and put on the banking system as a result. The difference is that in 2014, there was also a geopolitical crisis at the exact same time. Now, you could, of course, remember that in 2008, Russia invaded Georgia that same year in the summer of 2008, just as the U.S. stock market was plummeting. But the scale of the Russia-Georgia war was really an order of magnitude less severe than the importance of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine was substantially greater from Ukraine, but also from Western countries, which imposed pretty strict financial and economic sanctions on Russia. And so if you want to understand the 2014-2015 crisis, you've got to look at it not only from the perspective of lower oil prices and the impact of those on the Russian economy, but also on the role that Western sanctions, U.S. and EU sanctions, chief of all, imposed on Russia's economy. And the cost was really quite substantial. There were a couple of different types of sanctions that were implemented. The most important ones made it difficult for Russia's biggest companies to raise capital in Western capital markets, above all in New York and London. Also, Russian oil companies were prohibited from buying high-tech oil and gas drilling equipment from the West, which made it difficult to undertake fracking, for example, in Russia, or offshore Arctic drilling. And as a result of that, 2014 saw Russia not only face the oil price crash, but also this second geopolitical shock at the same time. And that made the task of Russian policymakers substantially more difficult, because they couldn't at that point turn to foreign funds to help find a way out of the crisis. Indeed, there was concern among many investors in 2014, 2015 that in fact sanctions might get more severe over time, and it discouraged many foreign investors from investing in Russia. And Russia, as a result, had to undertake very severe deleveraging, paying back a substantial portion, about a third of its overall corporate sector foreign debt, primarily in dollars and euros in the years after 2014, because companies were either unwilling to refinance at all or could only do so at a substantially worse price than before. Nevertheless, I think the interesting part is that although the 2014 crisis was even more difficult for Russia than the 2008 crisis, the same set of policies that worked in 2008 worked again in 2014. One, Russia had a substantial reserve, both at the central bank and in the government's own reserve fund that could be spent down. Two, Russia had an independent central bank that was able to let the ruble float with market forces, and that created a depreciation that more or less balanced Russia's current account. Three, Russia again implemented a bank bailout, which again was far from an optimal economic policy, but it was certainly an effective economic policy, making sure that no Russian banks failed in a disorganized fashion. Indeed, none did fail in a disorganized fashion. And so the same set of policies that worked in 2008 were repurposed in 2014. And I think you'd say they worked again in 2014, not again in terms of producing rapid economic growth. That hasn't happened, and nor in producing a sort of optimal economic efficiency from a theoretical perspective. I think there's plenty of questions to be asked about whether Russia implemented optimal policies. Probably not, but it certainly implemented effective policies from the perspective of the Kremlin, which was primarily interested in economic stability, avoiding economic crisis of the type that brought down the Soviet Union or brought Russia to the brink of default in 1998. That certainly didn't happen in 2014, just as it didn't happen in 2008. And from the perspective of the Kremlin, that was the number one goal. And because the policies achieved that goal, the policies were considered a success.
Putin avoided two crises back to back in 2007-8 and again in 2014. But the private sector has always been marginalized. The influence of the state is bigger than ever before. Oligarchic aristocracy is also quite large and growing, and they always find a way to extract the money out of the country. Yet Putin remains very popular with his political base, and largely because I think he has delivered on the rising pension to the elderly, whereas the younger generation does not have the access to more resources and education and develop skills, so they end up, if they can, leave the country. This dichotomy in how Putin deals with younger people and how he deals with the elderly has shaped the Putinomics in many ways. Tell us more.
Well, I think that's right. And it's an area that's changing rapidly, especially under the effect of a third oil price crash that we've seen over the past 3 months as the shock of COVID has rippled through the global economy. In some ways, Russia currently is trying to replay the exact same policy mix that it deployed in 2014 and 2008, thinking that it's in the same type of crisis today as it was then. And in some ways it is. The Russian government faces a growth slowdown, it faces depreciation of the ruble, it faces pressure in the banking sector, all types of things that have been seen twice before. But I think there are reasons to ask whether the current crisis that Russia is in is different. Obviously, it's different in that now there's a public health aspect that coincides with the economic shock of lower oil prices and the effect of the lockdowns within Russia itself. But beyond that, there's a broader question of whether the social contract that underlay the Putin system over the past 20 years is still effective. And what I mean by that is this: for the first decade of Putin's time in power, the Russian elite in the 2000s had a deal with the populace, which is that they would deliver rising wages and rising pensions every single year, and in exchange, no one would complain. And the Russian populace in the 2000s gladly accepted that deal and got rising wages in response. After 2008, wage growth declined substantially. It's been basically flat from 2013 to present. When you look at real disposable incomes, there's been no increase. We're approaching a decade now with no increase in living standards, which is a pretty mediocre economic record from the perspective of household living standards. But the past 10 years have seen a different social contract. Gone were the days that Putin promised rapid living standards. Now, Putin over the past decade has promised instead to make Russia a great power on the world stage. And from the perspective of Russians, he's done that by annexing Crimea, by building a new suite of nuclear weapons delivery systems, and by involving Russia in an array of conflicts from Ukraine to Syria to Libya. And that social contract has worked too. It's brought together different parts of Russian society, but powerful groups within Russia that have kept Putin's popularity at a stable and relatively high level. Now I think the question is, can this social contract persist amid what looks likely to be another several years, about a half decade of further stagnation? And I think here we have substantial questions beginning to be asked about the durability of the Putin system. It's worked marvelously well for the Russian elite the past 20 years, but I think we're beginning to see the challenges that it's going to face over the next decade unless it finds new methods for gaining support. I'll flag 2 data points for you that I think are useful to give evidence of where Russian opinion is headed. First, if you look at data from the Levada Center, which is the only remaining independent polling company in Russia, you find that Russians, majority now say they want term limits, or rather age limits on the presidency, and they want age limits that are low enough that would prevent Putin from running for president again when his current term ends in 2024, which is a pretty worrisome sign if, like Putin, you're planning to run again in 2024. That a majority of your fellow citizens would prefer that someone your age not be able to run. That's one data point. The second data point is that more Russians today say that from a political perspective, they value more the ability to change the ruler than they value the provision of political stability. That, too, I think is dangerous for Putin, because the only thing he can offer is political stability. He can't offer to allow Russians to change the ruler, since he is a ruler, and he's not offering to leave. Now, the more Russians demand change, the less he's able to deliver it. And so I think the big question is, what's the new social contract that can undergird the third decade of Putinism that we're currently in the first year of? Is there a sort of new social coalition that Putin can bring together to buttress his authority? It's possible, perhaps, that he's able to do it just by intensifying repression and making it ever more costly for people to involve themselves in politics. If so, that might be enough. Just tell the populace to keep their nose out of politics by raising the cost, putting more people in jail, bringing more court cases against those who protest. But if that's not enough, there will need to be some sort of new economic agenda as well. And this is where I think the economic policies that worked so well for Putin and the Russian elite in the 2000s today look like they're not really responsive to the issues that are of concern to most Russians. Because in the 2000s and the 2010s, most Russians wanted, above all, stability. That's what all the polling data suggests. The 1990s were a period of great instability, and just by providing macroeconomic stability, Putin built up a deep well of support. But now we've had 20 years of stability in Russia, and increasingly we see in the polling data Russians associating continuation of Putin's rule not with stability in a good sense, but rather stability in a bad sense, even stagnation as a word that's being increasingly used. And the more that the economic policies of Putinism are associated with stagnation, the less tenable they become over time. So I think there's no reason to expect that tomorrow or this year or even next year, the Putin system will face immediate social pressures. But I think pressure is building for some sort of change, and that change is going to not only require change of the guy at the top, but rather change of the social contract and the economic underpinnings of that social contract that undergird the social and political system. And that's where I think we're already beginning to see the end of Putinomics. The Putinomics that has worked so well over the past two decades for the Russian elite is not working that well at resolving the problems that they need resolved, and is not working that well at addressing the issues that the average Russian faces. And so I think when we look ahead and say, what's the future of Putinomics, it seems to me that the future of Putinomics is one that at the very least is in flux, because it's got to change if it wants to stay relevant. And if it doesn't change, it will quickly find that changing Russian political views have made it irrelevant, or will make it irrelevant soon.
3 pillars of Putinomics has been, as you explained in the book, is absolute control of the state, social stability, and third, limited opportunity for private sector when it's possible or when it's necessary. But one thing in all these last, especially in the last 10 years, one thing, even though oil prices have been very volatile and changing, and as we speak has come down considerably from 5 years, one thing has remained constant, and that is Russia's dependence on oil and energy and gas complex. And that has not changed. What do Russian elite think of this dependency? Why Russia or Putin or the elites in the bureaucracy have not managed to wean off Russian economy from this energy dependency and develop other industries, maybe biotech, maybe tourism, maybe manufacturing, maybe other industries that could give more opportunities for these young people to start new industries and with the help of the Russian government?
Well, I think there are 2 points worth emphasizing on the question of diversification. The first is that any country with the amount of oil and gas reserves that Russia has is going to be dependent on oil and gas exports. It's sort of like Saudi Arabia, which has roughly comparable oil reserves to Russia. There's just no scenario, no matter how many other industries Saudi Arabia develops, in which Saudi is not going to be dependent on oil and gas, and I think the same is realistically true for Russia under any scenario. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't many things the Russian government could have done to have tried to provide other sources of jobs or foreign exchange income. And I think when you look at why other industries haven't been built in Russia, why there haven't been investments in other sectors, you turn back towards the microeconomic policies that, as I mentioned earlier, are highly mediocre because they've never been a focus of Putinomics. Putin got the macro side right. He got macro stability right. But the microeconomic policies were always mediocre at best and often wrong. So, for example, for small and medium-sized enterprises, property rights are still extraordinarily weakly protected, and it's very common for businesses that once they reach a certain size, they attract the attention of local security agents and then have to begin paying bribes to local security agents to avoid having questions raised about their business. Anti-monopoly regulation is very poorly developed, and so there's not competition in many sectors of the Russian economy where there ought to be. Across the array of regulatory questions, across most of the sort of microeconomic regulatory questions, Russian policy is mediocre at best, and in many ways has made little improvement since Putin took power. And so this is, I think, the great failing of Putinomics. Now, it's worth noting that it's not really that much of a failing from the perspective of Putin, because the Russian elite has done extraordinarily well just by exporting oil and doing little besides that. They've found that it works quite well for them. It's more problematic for those who are not part of the Russian elite, small and medium-sized entrepreneurs or people looking for jobs outside the state sector. They're the real victims of the inability to develop non-oil and gas-focused industries. But there are also people who have basically no political voice and so no ability to shape economic policy in a way that would suit their interests.
With the, let's say, the anticipated stagnation or very low growth rate of less than 1 or 2% or even lesser growth rate, and with the continuous or continual rise of China, the gap between the Russian and Chinese economy is only going to increase. And the gap between the Russian and the United States economy, which has become a gulf, will continue to grow even bigger. Will Putin's Russia or Russian Federation after Putin will become ever so marginalized that it will be forced to take more extreme measures to reassert itself on the global stage when its economic muscle never matches with its aspiration?
I think what you see historically in Russia are sort of pendulum swings, or maybe a sine curve of increasing and decreasing willingness to pay for foreign policy. Certainly over the past decade, we've seen a steady increase in willingness to pay, increase in defense budgets, willingness to accept foreign sanctions, willingness to provide subsidies to Russia's handful of allies abroad, places like Maduro's Venezuela or Assad's Syria. But we also find historically that after periods of intense willingness to pay for foreign policy, you often find that Russia swings back in the opposite direction and devotes itself to internal construction rather than to foreign policy. And I think we shouldn't be surprised if we find that we're currently not too far away from the cusp of a similar shift where where we've seen the results of a period of intense investment in foreign policy, of very high levels of spending, and perhaps that will swing back at some point in the not too distant future towards a more restrained foreign policy, not because Russians have changed their view about the role that they ought to play in the world, because they've come to realize the costs of their expansive vision are just simply growing too expensive compared to their ability to pay for them.
In other words, Russia always has the ability to surprise you. Even when you think it's about to collapse, it will become very pragmatic. And even when you think it's about to take all the things right, it turns impractical.
Well, that's, I think, the greatest difficulty is in trying to predict anything about the future of Russia, because, of course, the past 2 centuries of Russian history are full of shocks that were unpredicted by even people who were at the center of the Russian political system. So I hazard very few predictions about the future of Russia.
Well, thank you very much. We have been talking with Professor Chris Miller, the author of Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia. Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you.